In this tutorial, we're going to talk about what Slippery Chicken actually does behind your back with the data you give it. But first of all, let's just remind ourselves of what we have to do to set up a Slippery Chicken structure. The first thing we'll do is define the instruments, and this will include the instrument's ranges, their chord function if there is one, whether it plays microtones, the missing notes an instrument may have, especially if it is a microtonal instrument. A lot of these instruments are already predefined for you and loaded when Slippery Chicken starts, but you can define your own instruments if you want as well, and even combine those with the standard instrument palette. Once those instruments have been defined, we then define the instrument changes for each of the players. Players and instruments are separate concepts and separate classes in Slippery Chicken. A player may play several instruments. For instance, a flute player may play both the alto flute, the standard C flute, and the piccolo and the bass flute. So you might need to specify where in the piece a player swaps instruments, and this you would do in the instrument change map. One of the things you would then do is define the set palette, and this could be done either by hand or possibly algorithmically, and that accounts for all of the remaining steps as well. Any of these steps could be done algorithmically. For instance, the rhythm sequence palette, I very often do define this algorithmically these days, though most of the examples you see will include a declarative approach to this kind of data. But in any case, you need to define a rhythm sequence palette for your Slippery Chicken piece. Once you have the rhythm sequence palette, you need to define the rhythm sequence map. This maps sequences onto instruments for the whole piece. So for instance, you need to specify that in the first part of the piece, say the first section, the flute player will play first of all sequence 1, then sequence 2, then sequence 3, etc. You can think of these sequences, if you like, as phrases or as blocks of bars of instruments. And you have to remember that each instrument or each player needs to have its own rhythm sequence for each sequence in the piece, whereas one set applies to one rhythm sequence for all of the players. So you get a vertical column of rhythm sequences for each player that they're playing with each other at any given time, and the set applies to all of those rhythm sequences at that point in the piece. So once you define the rhythm sequence map, you then need to specify the set map. Then you would define the tempo map. The default here is quarter note equals 60, so you don't have to define it if you can accept that. But if you need another tempo, you would need to define it for the very first bar at least. But you can then change the tempo for any of the bars subsequently. You could also define your tempos in terms of a curve. See the documentation for more details on this. Once you've done that, you might want to define the set limits, both for each of the instruments or for the whole ensemble together. And again, see the documentation here, or indeed one of the other tutorials. Once all the data has been entered, it's important to understand the concept of how pitches and rhythms are combined in Slippery Chicken. Pitch selection algorithmically is not a trivial thing. Each person would match pitches to rhythms according to their taste, their cultural background, and all kinds of factors. But the basic assumption is that if I were to offer you a series of rhythms, a sequence of rhythms in the Slippery Chicken sense, and ask you to choose pitches for those rhythms, then the pitches you choose would actually be influenced and dependent on those rhythms. Similarly, if I were to give you a sequence of pitches and ask you to supply rhythms to those pitches, the rhythms you choose would be dependent and influenced by the given rhythms, so they are interdependent. So it's really central to the concept of Slippery Chicken that when you define rhythms, you define pitch curves. So this is quite different from the total serialism approach of deriving pitches and rhythms separately from the same series, but separately. I very much want one to be influenced by the other, as I think this makes the most musical sense. So each rhythm sequence has an arbitrary number of pitch curves which you can enter. That means you might think that a rhythm sequence can go in one direction in terms of pitch, or perhaps in another direction. There might be several solutions. These pitch curves are just lists of numbers, and these numbers represent pitch height. So the number 2 would indicate a pitch higher than 1, or a leap from -1. The range of the numbers in the pitch sequence is completely arbitrary. It's up to you. They will then be scaled later on when we're selecting pitches from the available set for a given instrument. So they're just a kind of indication or a hint of what a curve for a particular rhythm sequence should look like. If you do give multiple pitch curves for one rhythm sequence, they will be selected in rotation each time that rhythm sequence is used in the piece. So the pitch curves will be combined with the current set, the instrument ranges, and any set limits you applied, and the numbers in the pitch curves will be mapped onto the notes of the set. Instruments will successively choose unused notes from the set, because what we try to do in Slippery Chicken is use as many of the notes that there are in the set as possible, so spreading them out amongst the whole ensemble. And in fact, you can define a hierarchy, if you like, to specify who gets first pick of the notes as the algorithm proceeds. So now let's talk about what Slippery Chicken does with all this data that you pass to it. And this is a step-by-step procedure now. First of all, the ensemble will be created and linked to the instrument palette. Then the instrument changes maps, where you switch from, say, flute to piccolo or clarinet to bass clarinet. These instrument change maps will then be initialized. Then maps and palettes are bound to each other and checked so that the references match. Then rhythm sequence and set maps will be checked for the same number of sections in the piece and for the same number of rhythm sequence or set references in each of those sections. After this, the pitch sequence map will be created. And in this case, the pitch sequences are cycled through each time a rhythm sequence is allocated to a player, as just mentioned. Then we'll initialize the tempo map. At that point, we'll generate the piece, selecting all the notes from the given rhythms and the pitch curves. So a set applies to all of the rhythm sequences played simultaneously by all the players. And the rhythm sequence and its pitch sequence for each player is passed with the set to the note selection algorithm, which we'll talk about in another tutorial. At that point, the low and high set limits are also passed to the note selection algorithm, and the current highest or lowest note for an instrument will be interpolated from these set limit envelopes that apply either to one instrument over the whole piece or to the whole ensemble over the whole piece. Once the note selection algorithm has finished, we get to the final steps of the initialization routine for Slippery Chicken. And this is where we just gather some statistics for the whole piece, for sections, for players and instruments, things like how many notes they've played, what their average tessitura is, things like that. And then we get to quite an important part of the algorithm, which is shortening fast leaps. I define a fast leap to be a 16th note at quarter equals 120. So we might want to avoid, in some instruments, having large leaps at that kind of speed. So the algorithm in Slippery Chicken cuts those down for you if the note selection algorithm has created such large leaps. You can change this threshold if you want, and also on an instrument-by-instrument basis, you can define what a fast leap would be. At that point, we do some final checks to make sure that the data is in order and the initialization routine returns.